I spent several, actually quite a few decades at FDA, and one of the things that I was doing there was working as the director of the patient liaison program. It started with HIV/AIDS patients and expanded from there. But during that period of time, expanded access became a very important tool for the agency and for the patient population. I think it's really important to remember that when those regulations were written, and we worked really hard to try and create and then refine those regulations over time, the purpose was really for treatment access for people who had exhausted other therapeutic options or had no therapeutic options. And for a long time, that was the case with HIV and AIDS. And so I come from a very long history of regulatory science and have a certain dedication to that, I suppose. But my feeling is that research is research, and it's for the development of systematically collected data for the purpose of analyzing and coming to conclusions about whether a product is safe and effective for its intended use in an intended population. And I think that something very different is treatment access, which is intended to provide treatment, but not necessarily to collect that type of data. So I guess, Greg, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we can start chatting about this.
Hi, I'm Greg. I'm an associate professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health, but more importantly, I've known Richard for, I don't know, like 30 years at least. And when he was in the FDA, I was outside of the FDA protesting along with my colleagues in ACT UP and the Treatment Action Group. We were going to talk a lot about this, but everybody loves to think about ACT UP in a very sort of monolithic way, in the idea that we were fighting just for access to drugs, but we were fighting for answers to drugs. And one of Richard and my good friend, who's no longer with us, Spencer Cox, taught me a lot about how to think about the needs that patients have that are not just about getting a pill in their hands, but knowing what it does in their body. So, Richard, should we just start a conversation?
I think we should. I think, having touched base beforehand, Greg and I are somewhat on the same page when it comes to expanded access, collection of data, and well-designed clinical trial protocols that really generate the necessary data to find out what it is that these drugs do inside the body, these medical products, and how valuable they are, what the risk-benefit ratios are, and whether they can be depended on and how they can be used best for treating a disease or a condition. So I think that in my mind, there's a lot of movement right now trying to push for real-world data, real-world evidence, and the expansion of expanded access for more uses. And people believe that you can collect a lot of data out of expanded access. The experience that I've seen at FDA has been that that's a lot more easily said than done. You're talking, when we wrote these regulations, one of the big concerns was trying to minimize the burden on treating physicians and patients. And part of that was, in the early days, realizing that the only people who were really getting access were those who were close to major medical research centers, because that's where doctors knew how to use the products, were more comfortable with putting investigational products into their patients. And people who are outside those areas, and particularly in rural areas, were not getting access. So a very important aspect or consideration at the agency was minimizing burden, because if you're going to put responsibilities and restrictions on treating physicians, they weren't going to be interested in using these products and making them available equitably to patients outside these research centers. And so essentially what you're collecting, or were collecting in those days, and these were rather large expanded access programs with literally tens of thousands of people who were being treated, was what kind of safety data is being generated, if any, and can you get that back to the agency? And so the experience was physicians are really overburdened already, taking care of their patients. They get a limited amount of time with patients. And I saw this particularly with other diseases. If they're treating a patient and they're using expanded access, if the patient develops a severe or a serious adverse event, they might report that, and hopefully they will. But a lot of times they're just too busy. If a patient dies, they don't report it because they moved on to their next patient. If the patient does well, that's usually not reported either. And I think if FDA gets a 30% turn on data for summary reports, that's probably a pretty good estimate, or something that would be considered very high return. So it's not easy to get data coming back to the agency. I don't know how easy it is for companies to get that kind of data back either. I think, as Paul was saying earlier, that's one of the conditions for expanded access through his company is, here are some questions. We want you to answer these. There might be a very different perspective on the part of treating physicians to the company than there is for the FDA. But I think it's a lot more difficult to get those kind of bits of feedback than many people believe it is, especially if you start asking complicated questions and you want the treating physician to perform what are essentially, regular monitoring that should really be part of a controlled clinical trial.
Thanks, Richard. I'll jump in. We don't have much time, but I think we have to go back to basics. For many people on this call, they are struggling with serious and life-threatening diseases for which there are no treatments that really work for them. And I remember those years. There was over a decade, there was actually about 15 years when we didn't have drugs that worked for HIV. And the idea that we needed hope and we needed something to live for was really important. But we needed to get a little bit harder nosed about what was being proposed to us. We fought for access to medications through accelerated approval. We fought for the parallel track, which, as Richard said, gave us 35 or 30,000 people got access to DDI and D4T over the course of several years before the drugs were approved by the FDA. But we also got our legacy hijacked. And I want to talk about this quickly because there's an idea that expanded access is a thing of the past, that small companies or even medium-sized companies or big pharmaceutical companies can't do it any longer. And that the only way you're going to get access is if you get a drug on the market as quickly as possible, because that's the shortest path and path of least resistance. But then you get drugs like Aduhelm, approved by the FDA with no real proof of efficacy, but real clinical risks. And what happens when you don't have expanded access is that there's an overwhelming push to get a drug on the market because there's assumptions built into it that that any drug is better than no drug and that a new drug is always going to be better than an old drug. And there are assumptions that have played out erroneously throughout medical history. So we need to think about how we reorient drug development. That expanded access, as Richard said, is used for access. But we have rigorous trials running side by side that are large enough to give us the answers we need about drugs. Because one of the problems about the early AIDS studies is they were too small to show clinical benefits. And we relied on surrogates that were of dubious benefit for many, many years. The other piece here is about the use of real-world evidence. We're not going to get reasonable, reliable estimates of treatment effects in the context of an uncontrolled registry or expanded access program. There are just too many unmeasured confounders in many diseases to let us have this assumption of conditional independence that what we're seeing is not the result of something that we haven't controlled for in our study. So it's really simple, right? We need to make expanded access a bedrock of drug development for moral reasons, right? And show moral courage and not the cynical moves in which you say we can't afford it or we give it to one or two patients. And the only way you're going to get your drug is if you push the FDA to approve it on the basis of some small move in a surrogate marker that hasn't been proven yet. So, we did it in AIDS, and people will say it's not the same in this disease or that disease, but we have a historical precedent for it. Don't be satisfied with getting drugs that you know less and less about and paying more and more for, as we move through the next decade of drug development. We all deserve a chance to live, but to do that, you need to have a drug in your hand and you need to know if it works.
Right. And I think, there's so much pressure to move products to the approved, category as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. And I'm not sure if small companies aren't driving a lot of that pressure, just as you're saying. There's always been, I think when I was at FDA, a lot of pressure coming for approval based on the most minute amount of questionable or spurious data. And I think that's something that people really do need to think a lot about, because if you don't know what those products are going to do and how well they're going to perform and how safe they are, particularly in the long run or even in the short run, you are being shortchanged and overcharged.
Yeah, I mean, Richard and I, been around the block for 30 years, and part of me, we're in the worst of both worlds in terms of the restrictions on access to expanded access for many diseases, and the smaller studies, the faster studies, the less rigorous drug approval coming to the agency, which it's not just Aduhelm. We can go through a history of the approvals over the past couple of years, the withdrawal of cancer indications by FDA last April for certain diseases and certain drugs. And so we need to reorient ourselves and think about the twin pillars of access and answers that we talked about 30 years ago for each disease that we are talking about today and that people care about. They're equally important. The idea that I'm better off putting a drug in my body without any knowledge if it works is another form of talking about Russian roulette. And there are plenty of drugs and aids, from Suramin to others, in which people would have been better off not taking a drug at all because it actually shortened their lives. So, to the drug companies that are here, it's part of your moral duty. And, you may say it's not my moral duty to my shareholders to make drugs available to people who want them, but it is really a part of the moral duty of us as a society of patients, clinicians, pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies to make sure that people can get access to drugs, which is the heart of the expanded access regulations. Drugs get approved by the FDA for expanded access very, very quickly. The stumbling block of the drug companies who say no can do, go to the FDA and get our drug approved tomorrow.
Well, I think, you've raised a couple of really important points. Access, you had mentioned earlier, newer is better. And that might be the case for candy bars that are bigger, crunchier, and tastier. But I think, people don't often appreciate the number of drugs that go into clinical trials but never come out on the other end, either because they don't perform, they're not effective, or they're not effective enough to make an improvement over something that's already available, or they do have severe adverse events that make them unpractical to use for therapies. And I think when you start providing access earlier in the development process, you are playing that Russian roulette game of not understanding what the drug is doing to other integrated systems within the body, and what ultimate and particularly long-term effects they might be having. So I think it is really important to remember that newer is not necessarily better, and that a real intensive understanding of what those drugs are doing and how they're doing it and mode of operation is really, really important.
And access and answers are not incompatible, right? We can get expanded access and we can get rigorous clinical trials and we can get rigorous follow-up studies from the drug companies. Remember who is important here. It's the patients, right? And the patients need access and answers. The drug companies are not your friends. The FDA is not your friend. The point is, you need to ask for both. We need to ask for both. And there's been an emphasis on speed and access over the past few years, which really turns many drugs into fiduciary transfer instruments, in which your money is put into the pocket of drug companies without rigorous proof that a drug works. And Alzheimer's patients are going to learn this all too well with Aduhelm over the next few years, and then the next set of amyloid busting drugs that comes down the pike. And so let's try to do things the right way and give people the access to the drugs they need before FDA approval, and make sure we get the answers during the critical path towards approval and then the post-marketing studies that should follow afterwards.
And the way that these studies or the way that these programs are ideally designed is that they're only for people who are ineligible and unable to participate in clinical trials, because the clinical trial is what's going to get that product to market if it's safe and effective. And I think that's another very important consideration, that expanded access is really reserved for people who can't participate or are unable for one reason or another to get into the clinical trial, either because it's inaccessible geographically or because they're ineligible because of entry criteria. But most people who are trying to get this drug should be trying to get it through expanded access so that they're contributing to the generalized knowledge of whether or not the drug is a safe and effective therapy.
Yeah, and I'm in the. We can't be Mr. Nice Guy anymore. We used to take over drug companies' offices because they wouldn't offer expanded access. Now we get called in by a patient representative and talked to, and patted on the head, as if we're these docile patient representatives. The point is, it's time to get angry at the companies and to show them who's in charge of our futures. And we did it, 30 years ago. Cancer patients have done it. Patients have done it with a whole bunch of other diseases. It's time to get angry at the people who control the fate. People who control the fate of expanded access are the drug companies. And return on investment for shareholders is one thing, but what they do for patients is more important.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And I think it's really important to push the companies to do that when it's appropriate, when there's additional or when there's sufficient data to support putting this into populations. And it's also really important for people to understand what expanded access is, and these are investigational drugs. Still, a lot is unknown about them, and there are definitely risks involved in taking those investigational products, particularly early on in development.
And that's why after phase 2 is when most of the AIDS clinical trials switched to offering expanded access for those who couldn't enroll in the study. So we're not talking about drugs that have come out of animal studies or been in 9 people in phase 1 studies. We're talking about phase 2, going from phase 2 into phase 3. An expanded access program needs to be in a parallel track along with the clinical trials.
Yes, and many of those early large-scale trials were bridges between phase 3 study and marketing. So that there was considerable data, particularly about efficacy and safety, before these drugs were put into large-scale treatment protocols.